Awesome, awesome. Well, I just want to say it is always a pleasure to really go over this in-depth information with you. So I'm just excited to be here once again. And everyone, thank you for being here and joining us today. I want to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Isaiah Green, and I serve as Assistant Deputy Director and Central California Regional Advisor for the Office of the Small Business Advocate, and excited to bring you some more in-depth information today. This is our sixth episode on labor and employment topics. Can you believe that, Bianca? Our sixth one. We've been going.
Yeah, it's flying by.
It's flying by. So if you haven't had a chance to see or listen to some of our previous topics that were covered, topics from paid sick leave or seeking and hiring new employees and so much more, please take the time to visit our website at calosba.ca.gov. Again, calosba.ca.gov. You will not be disappointed. And so I want to say a big thank you to the California Chamber of Commerce and the Small Business Policy Council for partnering with the Office of the Small Business Advocate on this series. Again, these conversations are all about giving California small businesses the tools, the knowledge, the resources that they need to confidently be successful when it comes to understanding labor and employment laws for 2025. And so today, Bianca will focus on meal and rest break requirements for California employers. We'll cover a few different topics, and I'll let her sort of talk a little bit about that, but how to make sure you're in compliance, ways to avoid common mistakes, and importance of clear policies and good record keeping. And so without further ado, Bianca, I want to say thank you again for sharing your expertise, your wealth of knowledge, and really your insight that can help all small businesses navigate these important topics. And again, this episode is recorded and it will be on our website post recording. And so I want to thank everyone for participating. And if you have questions, we will have time for Q&A at the end. So please use the Q&A box. And we welcome it. We look forward to answering your questions. So without further ado, Bianca, I want to pass it on to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Isaiah, for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, I can't believe we've done so many of these already. They fly by. There's a lot of information. So of course, before we get into the agenda, because we're going to cover a lot today, as is always the case, just our standard disclaimer reminders that, of course, nothing in the presentation be relied upon as legal advice. You may have specific situations where you'll need to consult with a qualified attorney to discuss your particular situation. And also a reminder, the contents of the presentation are current as of the date of the presentation. As we know, in California, things can evolve very quickly, so just keep that in mind to those of you who are going back and listening to the recording at a later date. And we also ask that the presentation not be recorded, duplicated, or distributed either in whole or in part without written consent from CalChamber and CalOSBA. All right, so here's our agenda for today's session. We are going to be talking all about meal and rest breaks, including what do we need to do if we have violations. That's going to trigger something that's called premium pay, so we're going to talk about that. And then we're also going to end with talking about employee handbook reminders. This is a theme that we're weaving out throughout our sessions because employee handbooks, while as we'll see, are not required, they are certainly a best practice. And meal and rest breaks in particular, this is one area of the law where employers, if they get it wrong, the violations are technical, they are unforgiving, meaning it doesn't matter if you had an intention to follow the law or that you weren't trying to deprive your employees of a meal break or a rest break. There are penalties for those, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And if you're doing it wrong and you're doing it wrong for a long period of time, that can be very expensive. So we're really trying to, again, get you that high level overview knowledge so that you know what are the things you should be looking for. If you have employees, it's really, really important that we're providing them those meal and rest breaks. And then, of course, we're going to have some key takeaways because I always like to round it out with a summary. If there's something that you missed during the presentation, again, I'm going to flag those key points for you to take home and hopefully be able to put into practice with your business. All right, so let's start off with meal breaks. Meal breaks do tend to be sort of the star of the show, if you will. There's a little bit more to meal breaks than what we'll see with rest breaks. Now, the other thing I should have mentioned at the outset, of course, is that when we're talking about our meal and rest break obligations, this is for our non-exempt employees, for our hourly employees. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, I have exempt employees, meaning I don't have to provide them meal breaks. I don't have to provide them rest breaks. I don't have to provide them overtime. That may be the case. And we actually have an episode entirely dedicated to the importance of proper employee classification. So again, if you haven't been following us along the way, definitely go back and check that one out, because you want to make sure that you're classifying your employees properly, because if you don't, again, that means you're not meeting all these obligations, and that's going to get you in trouble going back 3 to 4 years. So, but bringing us back now, we're assuming that our employees that we're concerned about for today's topic are non-exempt. What are our obligations? So we need to provide those non-exempt employees with an unpaid meal break of shifts greater than 5 hours. Now, the break has to happen on time. That means we need to start it before the end of the 5th hour of work. If they have a shift that is 10 hours or longer, that means they're also going to be entitled to a second meal break. These breaks have to be duty-free. We'll talk about what that means, and uninterrupted. That means that we can't have the phone ringing at their desk and interrupting them to ask them a question, walking by their cubicle, anything like that. It's uninterrupted. It's duty-free for them for that entire 30-minute period. This also means we have to allow them to be free to leave the premises. We can't control them and say, you have to stay, on site, right? They're free to do what they want to do during that time. It's also important that we don't prevent or discourage our employees from taking meal breaks. So again, depending on our industry, if the nature of our work is very busy, maybe a restaurant, there's a lot going on. Maybe you get a big rush. We can't hint to them or do things that are going to prevent them and say, oh, I'm just going to skip my break, right? They are entitled to that time. So let's talk about then what are our obligations when we're talking about providing that break? What does that look like? So as I mentioned, we're relieving them of all duty, and that truly is the case. We can't leave them with the phone to answer, leave them at their reception area if they're a receptionist, where they still might have to talk to a customer or a client coming on site. We have to relinquish control over their activities completely. And it means we're providing them that reasonable opportunity to take that uninterrupted 30-minute break. And again, we're not impeding them. We're not discouraging them from taking their break in any way. Now, the law does recognize we're not required to ensure or police that employees take meal breaks, but you don't want to get too comfortable with that thought and say, well, and assume that just because it's enough for you to just tell them, yes, you need to take a break and you're entitled to it. Because again, if you're not doing something to actively ensure that they are taking their break, then what could happen is later down the road, they may claim that they were prevented or impeded or discouraged from taking their break, and the burden will be on you to demonstrate otherwise. So just keep that in mind. It is true that we don't have to police it, but the way that shakes out in reality, if you end up in front of the labor commissioner's office, might be a little bit tricky. So again, just something to keep in mind, and we'll talk about what are some best practices and things that you can do to avoid those issues. Now, I mentioned that these are technical. The timing is very important. We have to provide the meal break by the end of the 5th hour of work. So what that means, it's no later than 4 hours and 59 minutes into their shift. So here on the slide, we have an example where if somebody is starting their shift at 8 a.m., then that means we're counting their hours of work. The end of their 5th hour of work is that 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. window. We need to make sure that they are starting their meal break no later than 12:59. Okay, so And you could chart it out this way for take any start time, as long as they're working more than 6 hours, they're going to be entitled to this meal break. And we need to make sure that they're getting it on time, because it's not enough just to get it. They also have to make sure that it is timely. Now, here's a great chart here that we have in terms of the number and timing of required, not only meal breaks, we also have rest breaks here. We'll show you this chart again too as we move into rest breaks. But as you can see, for a standard 8-hour shift, an employee is going to be entitled to 1 meal break. As I mentioned, once they get into that 10+ hour territory, they are going to be entitled to a second meal break. Now, we're going to talk about the ability to waive in a moment. That is recognized there. Again, if their shift is no longer than 6 hours, then they can waive that first meal break. If they have a longer shift where they're entitled to a second meal break, they can waive their second meal break, but they must have received their first. So again, something to keep in mind. Once you get into the 12, 14-hour territory, they cannot waive it. Okay, so just again, a great visual to see how many meal breaks, how many rest breaks, and we'll be flagging the rest breaks again once we get to that section. So I mentioned waivers, that meal breaks can be waived. Again, this is very specific circumstance. So again, that shift cannot exceed 6 hours. If you have somebody who's scheduled to work 7 hours or 6 hours and 15 minutes, that is too long. They will be entitled and they will need to receive their meal break. But if they have a shift that's exactly at 6 hours, or if it's any time shorter than that, then they can choose to waive. As I mentioned, if it's that longer 10 to 12 hours, they can waive that second meal break. But again, they have to have taken their first meal break. Now, the thing about waivers is they do need to be voluntary, and it does require mutual consent of both the employee and the employer. So we want to make sure that they know the waivers are revocable, meaning they can change their mind. Oftentimes, employers will have maybe a standing waiver in place for those shorter shift employees where let's say that as a practice, the employee says, I don't really think I'm going to ever have a need to take my meal break, so I do want to waive it because my shift is 6 hours or shorter. They can do that. You want to have it written waiver. That's going to be the best practice, because that's going to be able to show, why they weren't taking their meal breaks if it's ever disputed down the road. But we want to make sure, again, that that they know on any given day, if they choose and they change their mind and they say, today, even though I'm working 6 hours, I would like to actually take my meal break, they can do so. So we have to make sure that they know that it's revocable, and we want to make sure that that's in writing. We did have a case just recently that confirmed that prospective meal waivers, meaning that an employee can have something in writing as long as it's not from, again, they weren't coerced, there wasn't anything unconscionable about the written agreement. They can actually agree to say, yes, I'm going to waive, going forward in the future, again, as long as they can revoke it. So that was some good news that we did get from employers, but you want to make sure that you're covering all your bases in terms of making sure it's voluntary and they know they can change their mind at any time. All right, now a note about on-duty meal breaks. This is different than a waiver than what we're talking about. Employees in some industries and in limited circumstances can remain on duty and continue to be paid without the penalty that we're going to be talking about, that premium pay. But it's only allowed if the nature of the work prevents the employee from being relieved of all duty. And that is it's a tricky standard to meet. It's for example, you wouldn't be doing this out of convenience because you don't want to have maybe multiple staff members, crossing over for certain times of the day, right? That is probably it's when it's really tied to the nature of the work. So we sometimes see this in like residential healthcare facilities where they're operating 24 hours on the clock. Again, there are specific requirements that have to be met. It does require a written agreement between the employee and the employer. And the employee does have to be allowed to revoke that on-duty meal break agreement at any time. Again, these are in very limited circumstances. So if you think that you might be in an industry or there might be a circumstance where the nature of work prevents the employee from being relieved of all duty, definitely consult with legal counsel. This isn't something that you want to just assume is okay and that you won't owe penalties for, because that's the last thing you want is you're having those violations, and then with those violations comes waiting time penalties, interest in terms of those wages that are owed that were not paid. So we do have a number of industry-specific rules that so certain industries do have exceptions to some of these rules. So, healthcare, residential care, like I mentioned, commercial driving, construction, and security services. Some of these exceptions do require that you have a valid collective bargaining agreement that's covering employees. So the key here is, for any employer, you always, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but I'll tell you now, is your wage order is going to be your best friend when it comes to a lot of your wage and hour requirements, and including the meal and rest breaks. And that is, they're going to be usually sitting around sections 11, 12 of the wage order. So for those of you who aren't familiar with wage orders, you should be, if you're an employer and you have employees, because these wage orders lay out a ton of wage and hour rules and requirements, and the applicable wage order depends on the nature of your business and your industry. So you want to make sure that you know the correct wage order, and then you have that posted up in the workplace, because that does have to be displayed where employees have access to it and can review it. Again, they'll have access to the information about the meal periods and the rest periods and all of that. So knowing your wage order is really important. We will drop in a link for you in the resources later that will include the Labor Commissioner's website, where you can access all of the wage orders. There's a guide that will help you determine which wage order applies to you. And then, of course, if you think you have any exception due to industry-specific rules, you'll want to consult legal counsel, because, again, the last thing you want to do is incorrectly assume that you're subject to some exception. Now, another thing that's really important with meal break records is you want to have records of those as part of your bigger accurate time records. For our non-exempt employees, we have to have time records for, their scheduled shifts, for the actual time that they work. So what is their schedule, right? Records of those. Records of when they're actually punching in for the day, punching out, and that's also including the records of meal breaks, which they will be punching out for and then punching back in for the remainder of the day. So we want to make sure that we're requiring our employees to record their meal breaks in our timekeeping system, and that those records are accurately reflecting when their break starts and ends. Now, an important note about rounding is that we cannot round the time for the meal when the meal breaks are taken. So some of you, hopefully not too many, because rounding has been dwindling. It's not fully eliminated yet in California, but it could be going that way. We don't know. We're still tracking some cases around this issue, but really what the courts seem to recognize is that with technology, there's less of a reason for rounding to be a thing. If you are rounding, there are requirements that you have to have in place to make sure that it's legitimate and that it's not done in a way that is only to the employer's benefit and not the employees. So number one, if you're rounding at all in any form or fashion, I would just highlight for you, consult legal counsel to make sure you're good there. But even if you are engaging in rounding practices for start and end of the shift times, you absolutely cannot round when it comes to meal breaks. So just know that. And then the other thing is that if we have non-compliant meal breaks in our clocking records, then that will raise a rebuttable presumption of violation. So if our clocking records are not accurate, meaning for whatever reason they're not captured that the meal break was taken, but maybe it really was, then it's on us to show that there actually wasn't a violation. And it begs the question, right? How are you going to demonstrate that it was taken if you're timekeeping records. What is the other record? Now, you may be able to have other records, but again, it's going to be on you to show otherwise. All right, so now let's talk about rest breaks. So rest breaks is what our obligation around this is. We have to provide our employees with what's referred to as a net 10-minute rest break for every 4 hours worked or major fraction thereof. So essentially more than 2 hours. So they're going to, every couple hours, they're going to be receiving this net 10-minute rest break. So what we mean by a net 10 minutes is they need to be able to get to a place where they have the ability to rest and have a full 10 minutes there. So if with their work, they're out in, you know, in a, let's say there's a manufacturing facility where the floor is large and the break room, the closest place where they can get to off the floor where they have the ability to rest is a distance, then we're not going to count the time of their rest break until they can get to that location. So that's what we mean by a net 10. Now, what's different about the rest breaks from the meal breaks is that these are paid. So they're not clocking out, but it's also a little counterintuitive because they are off duty. So it is considered hours worked, meaning they're not clocking out for the break, but it's still paid time. So they're not clocking out, and we do have to relieve employees of all duties and relinquish control over how they're going to spend their break. So like we saw with the meal breaks, this means that we cannot require them to remain on call. We cannot require them to remain on premises. Now, there are, again, very specific, narrow exceptions to the requirement to remain on premises. If you think that you're in one of those situations, then you absolutely want to consult with legal counsel, but those are extremely limited. That's why we're not even covering them in detail. So for the most part, your average employee, again, they have the ability to go. Now, because I present on this topic a lot and we get questions all the time from our helpline members and the like, oftentimes there's a question and concern around, well, we don't want them to leave the premises because we're concerned about workers' comp. If something happens to them while they're off-site, then will it be covered by workers' compensation? But they weren't working, so it shouldn't be. So, and I get that. I understand that's a natural concern that some employers will have, but the question of workers' comp coverage is a separate issue. And again, that's going to be determined, are they in the scope of their employment duties? If they're not performing their duties, then again, that's for workers' comp to sort out. And in terms of, then another question that we often get is, well, it's only 10 minutes. So if we let them leave the premises, then, what if they take longer than the 10 minutes to which they're entitled? And that could be a legitimate issue, right? Maybe there's a coffee shop down the street. But of course, we know by the time you get out the door, you get to the coffee shop, there's a long line, they have to come back. That very well could take longer than 10 minutes. And so if it's an issue of the time, then that's, again, where having a handbook is great. You have, your policy in place, and you still let your employees know, yes, you are free to leave the premises, but you're still limited to a certain amount of time. So that's one way that you can handle it. But again, we can't control them, and we can't require them to, stay in the building, stay on site in any way. Now, if the shift is less than 3.5 hours, then there is not going to be a rest break required at all. So if we're in that very short shift situation, then there is not going to be a rest break entitlement. So again, as I promised, we have this again in another form for you that has not only the rest breaks, but you can see the meal breaks again. So again, we're looking at a standard 8-hour shift, focusing on the rest breaks column now. That's going to be 2 rest breaks that they're entitled to. And those are going to fall on both sides of the meal break. So for a standard 8-hour shift, you're going to have that rest break somewhere in the late morning. right? They're starting in the morning. And then they're going to have their meal break, again, no later than the end of that 5th hour of work. And then in the afternoon somewhere, you're going to have the rest break. The rest breaks are a little squishier in that we don't have that technical piece in the timing, right? We want it to fall within those every few hours to fall somewhere in the middle, but it's not as if you don't take it by X hours and minutes into the shift, there is a violation. But we need to make sure that they're getting them. So again, how we're going to time it, again, is going to be based on what is their schedule, when are they getting their meal break, and we can always have our employees, one good practice, if you want to take the guesswork out of it, is that you just tell your employees that here's when you take your first break, here's when you take your meal break, and here's when you take your second break for a standard 8-hour shift. That's definitely one way. And then there's no guesswork and no room for error there. All right, so how do we show compliance, though, for the rest breaks is often a question we get because, as I mentioned, unlike the meal breaks, employees are not clocking out for their rest breaks. But there are still things that we can do to demonstrate compliance. So as I mentioned, we can schedule the rest breaks, okay? If employees know they have a standard 8-hour shift, they know that at X hour, they're going to take their first 10, and at the next hour, they're going to take their next 10, and you have the coverage that you need so that there's no issue in terms of the ability for them, right? So that's something we can do, avoiding any practices that are going to prevent employees from taking breaks. So again, that can be making sure you have enough staff on hand so that you have the coverage depending on what their role is and what they're needed to do. If you need to have continuity in whatever machine they're operating, or whatever the case may be, appropriate staffing is going to be something that you'll want to be looking at, right, as a way to mitigate. And then also what we can do is we can have timekeeping attestations to confirm that the breaks were indeed provided. So whether it's at the end of every day when they're clocking out, there's a window that could pop up that's them confirming that they did receive their rest breaks for that day. Again, just one example, but having some sort of way that they're affirming that they did receive their breaks for the day or for that week, however you want to do it. And then having a legally compliant rest break policy is going to be important. Distributing that to your employees and enforcing it consistently. Not only having the policy and distributing it and enforcing it, and a big key of enforcing it is making sure that your managers and your supervisors are also trained on the policy. And oftentimes our managers and supervisors can be the cause of the violations, right? Depending on how they're managing their team. And again, if they don't have the appropriate coverage, and that's preventing an employee from having the ability to take a rest break or a meal break. So making sure that our managers are trained on the policy and they know how to enforce it, and that if they're seeing employees miss their breaks, they can identify that as an issue and then talk to the employee to find out what's going on, and is it because of something, again, the nature of their work, or something that from the employer side that is doing to prohibit or prevent them from taking their breaks. All of that's going to be really important to make sure that our policy actually has some weight, because we can have a policy and roll it out, but if we're not doing anything with it, we're not enforcing it, and we're not making sure our managers know about it and are enforcing it, then it's not really going to be very beneficial. All right, so now that we've talked about the requirements for the meal breaks, we know those are technical. We know they have to clock out for those. It's 30-minute uninterrupted, and we have to relinquish control. It's off duty completely. The rest breaks, they're not clocking out, but we're still relinquishing control and relieving them of all duties. So what happens if there's a violation? First of all, we'll look at what is a violation, and then what is the premium pay. So violations can happen in a number of ways, remember, because it's uninterrupted and it's off duty. So if we don't provide the break at all, okay, they just didn't get a break that day, that's a violation. If they get a late break, even if it's only 1 minute into that 6 hour, that is going to be a violation. That's what I meant by these are technical, unforgiving. So we have to make sure that our employees know that they are getting it no later than the end of that 5th hour work. And then providing a short break. Again, maybe because they got it late, but we're still expecting them to be back clocked in at a certain time, or maybe they got their break on time, but then during that 30-minute period, we interrupted them and we're requiring them to come back early. That could be a violation as well. So with rest break violations, that can be, again, well, we're just not authorizing or permitting them to take that uninterrupted 10-minute rest break for every 4 hours of work. And so again, this is where the policy is going to be important, and the policy can really, we can empower our employees and say, you are entitled to this. And, you have the ability to take it. And, if an employee, hopefully they feel that they have the ability to do so, right, without asking their manager for permission. Maybe their manager's in a meeting and they want to take their break, right? Are we going to require them to do that? That could be a situation where now we're prohibiting, we're impeding their ability to have a break. So these are the types of things, again, depending on the nature of your business, depending on your staff size and how your supervisors are set up, that you want to be looking at to mitigate the chances of a violation. So what's the cost if we have a violation? Because we do have to pay employees for meal break violations and rest break violations. If they have both, then we pay for both to an extent, and we'll talk about that. So a premium is 1 hour of pay at the employee's regular rate of pay. So this is separate from and in addition to the wages that are paid for hours worked, including overtime. The premium pay does have to be reflected on the wage statement. So when we say regular rate of pay, it's not necessarily just their hourly rate. If there are other forms of compensation that are paid to the employees within that work week. So we have to look at if they get piece rate earnings or commissions, non-discretionary bonuses. So we're generally, again, looking at the total compensation earned in that work week divided by the total hours worked to get. So in addition to being the regular rate of pay being used for premium pay, the regular rate of pay is also important to be aware of for purposes of paying overtime, because overtime is paid at the regular rate of pay, which is not necessarily going to be just their straight hourly rate. And it also comes into play for reporting time pay and for sick leave. So there are different calculation methods that are required if you're paying multiple hourly rates or non-discretionary bonuses. Again, just for you to be aware of that, if there are those other forms of compensation, that is going to be relevant when you're looking at the regular rate of pay. Okay, so we know that premium pay is owed when there's a violation of a meal break and or a rest break. We know that that premium pay has to be paid at that regular rate of pay. So when might it be owed? So if we're not relieving employees of all duties, if we're not relinquishing control over the employee's activities, maybe we're requiring them to stay on the premises, or if we're not permitting them the reasonable opportunity to take that uninterrupted 30-minute meal break or the 10-minute rest break. Similarly, if we're preventing or discouraging them from taking meal and rest breaks. All of these things can trigger premium pay. Now, I don't know that I want to call it good news, but one, I suppose, a point of relief is that there is a maximum of the potential premiums that could be owed per day. So it is a maximum of 2 premiums that could be owed per day. So you get there's one premium for any missed meal break. So let's say you've got a 12-hour shift employee. They didn't get either of their meal breaks. So that's 2 meal breaks that they did not get. They're still only going to get 1 hour of premium pay for that. And then they'll get one premium for any missed rest breaks. And that's even if they were entitled to multiple rest breaks, and they didn't get any of them, they're still only going to get 1 hour of premium pay for their rest breaks. So it is a 2 premium maximum per day, but we do need to make sure that it's accounted for if we become aware that a break was not taken or wasn't taken timely, or if it was interrupted, excuse me. Now, when is premium pay not required? And this is the big if here. So if you provide the employee with the opportunity to take meal and rest breaks, and the employee chooses not to do so, then no premium pay is owed. Now, the kicker here is that employers have the burden of showing that the breaks were provided. So documentation is going to be very important for this piece. Again, this is one of those things that, yes, you can do, but you want to exercise caution around it, because what we often see and what I've seen when I practice and continue to see happen can be litigated is that you have an employee, let's say they're happy to not take their break. And they're given the opportunity, they don't want to take it. So employer agrees, and they're like, yeah, I voluntarily, I don't want to, I'm choosing not to take my break, so no premium pay is owed. Well, if the employer isn't documenting that in any way, then what happens is later down the road, of course, with employees, things are good until they're not. And when they're not good anymore, and you have an employee who may be disgruntled or quits or something happens, now they're looking back and they might be looking at things differently, or they might be claiming things that maybe didn't happen the way they happened. And so now it's your word against theirs. And if brought in front of the labor commissioner, then you're going to need to demonstrate how that this was indeed provided. So you want to make sure that it's documented. But here's a better practice is to avoid having to go down that road is you can consider disciplining employees for not taking their proper breaks. And again, this goes all the way back to your policy, and you as the employer can require that employees do take their breaks as required under law to help you meet your obligations. And if they're not following the policy, then you can address it from a disciplinary standpoint as a policy violation. So again, you want to be careful about because if you and especially if you have that policy and you're saying that's what the policy is, but then on the other hand, you're allowing employees to just willy-nilly choose, I don't want to take a break. Again, they're not in a 6 hours or shorter situation where they can waive it. You just have your policy that they must take it. And then if they're not, then it's a disciplinary issue. And the other thing is that, and if it comes to your attention that they miss it too, you will have to find out why did they miss it. And oftentimes that's going to it may mean a premium situation. Because let's say an employee says, I didn't choose to take my break. Or I chose not to take my break. But if the reason that they chose not to take it is because they were buried in work and they felt they didn't have enough time to do all the things they need to do, right? That's a problem. That's a clear situation where then we need to be paying. So it can get dicey with going on this assumption that we don't need to pay premium pay. All right, now you've heard me say by now, again, documentation around this area is going to be key to demonstrating compliance. So that's the timekeeping records that are reflecting the meal breaks. And then when violations occur, again, this is where training your managers is key. You want to make sure that you're documenting the reason for the violation. So you can do that by having the employee complete a missed break form. And that's also going to help us, again, to inform us that we need to pay the premium pay, and we need to reflect that payment for any premium on the wage statement. It does need to be a separate item demonstrated on the pay stub that shows there was a premium paid for that. You can use a timekeeping attestation, of course, so that employees can confirm that they've been provided all their meal and rest breaks. Again, that could be something that you even do daily. At the end of the day, that they have the ability to confirm. If they're saying they didn't, then that's a flag for you to investigate and find out why they didn't take it, why they didn't get it, and to make sure that we're paying the premium accordingly. And then if you do have situations where you have those employees where they have the ability to waive either their first meal break or their second meal break, you want to make sure that you're maintaining those written meal break waivers. All right. So that was a lot of information. And you've heard me mention, again, handbooks, specifically around meal and rest break policies, which I'll highlight here in a moment. This slide, again, we've talked about this in other episodes. Again, I encourage you to go back and, review the other episodes where we've talked about, other topics. So handbooks, as a reminder, again, they're not legally required, but they are going to be a recommended best practice because it's a clear way to communicate to your employees. What are the expectations? What are the policies and procedures? Reducing confusion, misinterpretation, again, allows your managers, your supervisors to enforce things consistently. If we're all subject to the same policy and there are violations, we're handling that, the same way. We have the same expectations of everybody, and that can help us to make sure that we're treating employees fairly. And of course, showing compliance with state and federal laws, and to help defend against legal claims. So going back to meal and rest breaks, that's where, again, having a policy is going to be key. This is going to be our first line of defense because our policy should demonstrate, again, our compliance with it, where we're informing the employees of the importance of the timing of their meal break, the fact that they have to be relieved of all duty, that it is, uninterrupted, all of those rules that we talked about, being included in the policy. So we should be including that policy in the handbook. Make sure that we're distributing it to our employees periodically, on an annual basis, for example, maybe more if we make a mid-year change to it, anytime we make an update, roll it out again, get that acknowledgement of receipt where the employee is acknowledging that they have received the policy, they read it, and we can have that documented. Now, another thing that we don't have time to get into today, but just mentioned in this, I think we talked about the PAGA reform, I think in one of our very first episodes, if not the first. But as a reminder for those of you who may be aware of it, there's a potential to have penalties capped with the PAGA reform that we saw take effect last year. And what that means is in order to take advantage of the potential cap on penalties, there are a number of things that employers have to do in order to demonstrate their efforts for compliance. One of those steps is actually having a policy around meal and rest break, among other wage and hour requirements. So distributing a compliant policy and making sure our supervisors are trained on it is also a really great reason why we should make sure we have that policy in place. So things that our policy should be doing, again, detailing when and how the meal breaks are provided, explaining that the employees do need to comply with the policy and take all of their required meal and rest breaks. Again, if you have individuals who are notorious for being late and are getting penalties, then you're having to pay penalties, and that's a concern. You can discipline the employees for violating the policy if the expectation is that they're going to take their break by a certain time period. Of course, instructing employees that they do need to clock out for their meal breaks, but we know that they're going to remain clocked in for their rest breaks. Requiring our employees to immediately report if they are not provided with their meal or rest breaks. Again, this is going to help us to make sure that we're paying any premiums that are owed, and of course, stressing the importance of following the policy and the consequences of not doing so. Again, disciplinary measures that may be taken. And again, if we have that spelled out clearly in the policy, there's no guesswork. The employees understand that that can be a topic for discipline. All right, so those are the key things that we want to keep in mind for having, hopefully we have a handbook. Even if you don't have a, fancy all-together handbook, you can certainly have certain policies that you distribute. Having a meal and rest break policy that gets distributed to your employees, even if it's a standalone, is still going to be a great thing for you to have in your toolbox. So takeaways. We, of course, want to make sure that we are providing those meal and rest breaks, that we are relieving employees of all duty and relinquishing control over them during the breaks. Accurate record keeping is going to be key. Remember the meal break start and end times. Remember, we're not logging out for rest breaks, but if we are concerned about documentation, we can still get that attestation from them periodically that they are receiving, let's say on a daily basis, that they receive their rest breaks for that day. Of course, when the breaks are not provided, that we're paying those premiums at the regular rate of pay. Again, that's important. Whoever is in charge of our payroll needs to be aware of that. And, of course, that's going to come up as an overtime obligation as well, because overtime would also be paid at that regular rate of pay. And we need to have that separate line item for the premiums on the employee's wage statements. And then lastly, all the things we talked about related to the handbook, whether you have, again, a handbook or not that has everything in one place, having some compliant meal and rest break policy and distributing that to your employees. And of course, your policy is only going to be as strong as you enforce it. So with that, it means you're going to discipline your employees who don't follow the policy. So again, I know we covered a lot, but I'm happy to take any questions with the remaining time that we have.
Awesome, Bianca. Thank you so much for that detailed, great information. We do have a few questions in the chat, and so I'll sprinkle a little bit out there for you to answer. Our first question came in really early from Tracy. And thank you all for asking questions. We welcome your questions. We want to make sure that we can answer anything that you have on the top of your mind in order for you to be successful. And so if you have questions, please throw them in the Q&A chat, and we will be sure to answer. So first question, Bianca, what if an employee forgot to clock out or in from their breaks and their time went over or under? What is the best way to document when correcting their time to cover their business?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's a pretty common one. That can be easy to easy mistake. So, it could be as simple as if the employee, let's say, is emailing whoever's in charge of payroll, say that they had an error on their timesheet, something. Again, as long as we know that the time that we're correcting is, the correction is accurately reflecting what they worked and when they were clocked out, that's what's important. So, again, having that email thread or, however it's going to be captured in writing that this was communicated to us by the employee. So again, we are still verifying that they did indeed have their full amount of time. Whichever way we're making the correction, we want to make sure it is documented.
Awesome. Documentation is important. So a few more questions for the sake of time. And again, if we don't get to your questions, I will leave a link in the chat for you to click on, and we will have opportunities for you to answer questions. So one question from Anna, she's asked, can the meal break be in between 30 minutes to an hour, or does it have to be exactly 30 minutes?
Oh, great question. So what the law requires is a minimum of a 30 minutes uninterrupted meal period. Some employers will allow employees to choose, do they want to take 30 minutes? Do they want to take an hour? So it could be longer. Again, that's going to be up to your business and what your policy says. If you are allowing employees to, for example, make that choice day to day. I've seen some employers do that. Some just have it. It's 30 minutes. That's all it is. Or on occasions they can take a longer meal break. And some employers are just a standard, and an hour is the standard. And that's also fine, again, because they're providing the minimum. So you can always provide more than what the law requires. You just want to make sure that you have it clearly communicated in your policy and that you're consistent with how that's applied.
Great, great. And I had a follow-up question. What happens if what happens if employees are aware that they can take 10-minute breaks, but they don't take them? Is that considered a violation for the employer?
Yeah, so it could be. And so this is that scenario that I was discussing where you may have an employee where it is a problem if they're not taking their breaks because again, how are we as employers have to demonstrate that they were provided, right? So that's where having the attestation is there, and that's why we're having your policy is going to be great. So let's say you have an employee who they regularly don't take their breaks. The first thing you want to do is find out why is that the case. Again, is it because the work is preventing them from having the opportunity? Because if there's anything about the situation, the circumstances in the workplace where an employee could claim I was impeded, I was discouraged, so much was going on, nobody was there to cover me, and that's why I didn't take my break, right? Then you're going to owe those violations. If they're truly in those situations where we talked about when the premiums are not owed, but of course I gave all the caveats as to why you still want to exercise caution on that. So yeah, if they're going to attest to say I had the opportunity to take my rest break and I didn't, but again, for all the reasons that we've talked about, you still have to be careful with that because, and number one, if it's in your policy that your employees are expected to and they're not, then they're regularly violating your policy. So that's where you can, again, discipline employees. If you have that employee who isn't doing that, isn't taking their breaks as expected, find out, number one, is there anything that we're doing that's impeding them from doing so? And if not, and they're just choosing not to, then we have that conversation, we let them know the expectation, and we discipline them if they're not taking their breaks.
Awesome. Thank you for that insight. So there are a few more, one more question and also a scenario. And so this is the last question we have. It's 2:57, so I want to be a respecter of everyone's time. Interesting question. Can an employer fire an employee for taking too many meal breaks? This person must be hungry, but just curious. Can they get fired
for taking
too many missed?
Oh, too many
missed.
Okay.
Forgive me.
Yeah. So that could be the case, right? Again, if you have that policy is locked in on and it clearly communicates you are expected to take your meal break, and you have an employee who's regularly not or is regularly only clocking out for 20 minutes, and then that's going to automatically trigger probably a premium pay. Sometimes you have employees who will game it, right? Well, they'll try to, where it's like, oh, I had to take it a little bit late. And so again, of course, if they're taking it late and it's because of circumstances that were preventing them, we always want to pay the premium. And that's going to be the default rules, that we're paying the premium if there's anything about it that's not compliant. But that said, we can discipline the employees if it's them that's regularly not taking their break. So you can, and we've seen that happen before. That's where your policy is really going to be your best friend.
Awesome. Bianca, there's another question that just popped up from April.
Okay.
Do I have to give 5-minute breaks in between every 30 minutes and pay if they work in 3.5-hour time slots?
Yeah. So if you have somebody who's only working 3.5-hour shifts, then they're not going to get the rest break if it's shorter than that. So if it's that 3.5 hours or shorter. So I think I can go back quickly to one of our charts here that shows again where you're going to, depending on the length of the shift. So if it's exactly 3.5, then they're not going to get a rest break. If we know that we're, somewhere between 3.5 to 5, they're not entitled to a meal break, but they will get a rest break, but not until they're 3.5, beyond the 3.5 mark. So, and then of course, as you go on, then that's when they're entitled to the meal break, and then you get additional rest breaks. So it's really going to be based on their length of shift.
Awesome. So last question, it's more of a scenario, Bianca. And so if an employee's schedule is 9 to 5, and takes 30 minutes unpaid meal breaks, that will be only 750 worked. Can I change the employee's schedule to 9 a.m. to 5:30 to make it an 8-hour shift?
Yeah. If they're you're trying to get them have an 8-hour shift, then you can do that, because that is true that for the time that they're clocked out for their meal break, that will not count toward their hours worked. So yeah, that does impact their overall shift. And that's the same thing to consider too. I think we had the question earlier about, if they have a longer meal break, that would be something for your employees to keep in mind as well. If they're still trying to meet their 8 hours, and that's going to make their day longer.
Awesome. The last question, because I saw I got thrown in. I know it's 3 o'clock, but I think this is a good one to end on. Are volunteers treated like employees?
Oh my goodness. Oh, volunteers. Okay, so here's the deal. If they're truly a volunteer, then no. But I will say this, that volunteers, if somebody's being truly classified as a volunteer, you have to make sure that they're really a volunteer, because sometimes people will think that they can have somebody as a volunteer when really they should be treated as an employee. And again, that means if you're not paying them at all in any form or fashion, you're violating so many things. You're not getting the paperwork that you need to have as a new hire, all of the things that we are obligated to do. So I would just say, again, you want to make sure you're on solid ground with the fact that they are a volunteer. Then yes, these things aren't going to apply. Now, if you have somebody volunteering you for a full day, would you still want to give them the opportunity to have a break? Yeah, I would think probably, right? But again, the bigger question is, are you sure that they're really a volunteer? So that's what I would push back on and say, because if that's not the case, then yes, all of these rules are going to apply.
Wow. Thank you. Bianca, I'm so grateful for your insight. I'm so grateful for your expertise. It sounds like a few of us are grateful for your insight and expertise based on the chat. And so, again, I want to say thank you. Thank you for today. Thank you for really feeding us this information. I want to say thank you to the California Chamber and also the Small Business Policy Council. Everyone, thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. We do hope that this information was fruitful for you and that it will continue to benefit you and your employees with your business. If you have not had a chance to go back and look at any of I said it was the 6th. This is the 7th episode we've done. And so if you haven't got the chance to see any of the other episodes on labor and employment, please click the link and check it out. A lot of great information there to make sure that you are in compliance, up to date, and successful as a small business owner. Again, Bianca, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we look forward to more interaction. And join us for the next one next month. We look forward to it. Bianca, thank you so much. And until next time.
Thanks, everyone.